Hello and welcome to Conversations with Ex-Catholics. Today's episode, I know I say this before every episode, but I'm like really excited for today's episode because this is a first for the Kevin Non-Try to Cath YouTube channel. I'm talking to somebody that I know in real life for the first time ever. Welcome to Calion, who, and we're going to get into this, but we went to school together for a long time. We went to college together, but probably more importantly, we went to like grade school together.
Long years.
Yeah, yeah. So I see that we've got Rosemary watching. What's up, Rosemary? How you doing? Thanks for being here. But Callion, what's up?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. Life, adulthood, lots of stuff, and also nothing.
I hear that. Um, I think that the first question that the
Mhm.
that the audience would kind of have for you, and before we get into the specifics, is so the thumbnail said like conversations with ex-Catholics. It also said leaving the FSSP. So
Right.
I take it you're not Catholic anymore.
No, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm sure people who watch your channel know your story. They know where you come from, the environment you were raised in, all the beliefs you had growing up. I mean, with some very slight differences in the beginning, like we pretty much had the same upbringing in terms of what we believe, what we were taught, how we were catechized, all that different stuff. So I'm coming from very much the same place that Kevin used to, and now I sort of describe myself. Definitely, if I was to give myself like a real label philosophically, it would have to be agnostic because I mean that's kind of how it goes. But um, I don't know, like when I have to sit down and give proofs for things, I come out pretty much where you come out on most of the sort of hard philosophical positions like nominalism and all those different, you know, the list goes on. But when it comes to sort of personal, emotional, spiritual stuff, I don't know. I'm always open to learn or try things or whatever. I don't know that I would ever say I can be convinced that they're true in the same sense that like I don't know that this computer is in front of me or anything like that. I would never have truth claims about religion anymore. I don't see myself being convinced of them like that. But I don't know. There's certainly a case to be made, in my opinion, for like a sort of emotional or social community based type thing. But in terms of actual philosophical positions, yeah, I would put myself basically in your camp.
I think I've said a couple times that I'm kind of jealous of certain religions, and like I'll often point to Judaism as something that I'm kind of jealous of because like it's somebody telling you that they're Jewish but they're also an atheist is not at all a contradiction. Like that makes
Yep.
total sense in just our culture today. Catholic atheist doesn't really make a whole lot of sense right now. Um, but maybe it will one day.
See,
Maybe.
it's funny that you say that because I think if you took 10 minutes to explain it to someone, you'd find there are a lot more of them than you think.
Yeah.
I mean, think about people like Lady Gaga or Madonna. They might be like, yeah, God exists, but they're not talking about hylomorphism and
No.
Neoplatonism and things like that. They're still going to put Mary Magdalene in their music videos, and they're still going to have like all the cultural elements of Catholicism that we all sort of recognize from our upbringing. They're going to use that because it's their culture as well, and they should.
Yep. I almost wonder if Catholicism is just like maybe a generation or two generations or something like that kind of behind Judaism in the sense of like maybe in 20 or 30 or 40 years from now it will be just as normal to say like yeah, I'm a Catholic atheist. Um uh, I don't get the feeling that that's the case literally right now
No,
because even like the people who you said like I don't think that somebody like well, I don't know Lady Gaga like
no, but
that,
no, I'm not
but
saying they consider themselves that, but
yeah, and I do feel like so I know a lot of people who call themselves Catholic and they don't practice
yep,
Catholicism, but they still wouldn't call themselves atheists
right.
yet, and I think that's kind of like the next step almost.
Exactly. Well, there's things like transubstantiation or the sort of very specific nature of the Trinity and all these different things that technically, from the church's point of view, you have to believe in this certain way that they've decreed. Otherwise, you're not a Catholic, but then you're baptized and it doesn't really go away. So it's sort of a weird middle area, right?
And it's almost like a lose-lose for some of us.
Yes.
Sometimes I'll tell Catholics, like, on the internet for the most part. I'll say, like, well, I am Catholic. And they'll be, no, you're not, because you're not practicing and this stuff. And I'll say, okay, okay, okay. And then sometimes I'll say, I'm not Catholic. And they'll be like, well, technically you are, because, you are,
Indelible mark.
right. And it's like, well, okay, like, pick one. And of course,
Exactly.
it matters who you're talking to. But Daniel brings up Sting and Scorsese. I knew that
Sure.
Scorsese
I
was
did not know that.
Catholic. I didn't know about Sting too, because Sting's British, isn't he?
Uh, yes, he is. Yes.
So I figured that he was like some kind of Anglican or something like that, but maybe he's Catholic. Daniel knows more about
Rebellious.
this stuff than I do. So, also, what's up, Jason? Uh, but okay, so I think the plan for tonight, Calion, is more or less. I know your story, but
Sure.
YouTube doesn't. So,
Right.
and I know you have a couple bullet points kind of prepared.
Yeah.
So I kind of just want to hand the microphone to you, and let you kind of start wherever you want to start. And I'll jump in with questions. And then also for
Mhm.
anybody who's listening, if you guys want to ask a question too, I can pull up your question too during it. I don't save them for the end too. We can kind of address questions as they come.
Yeah.
Um,
Feel free to ask anything. I'm not generally. I'm pretty much an open book. So anything you really want to ask, I'm down to talk about.
cool. Okay. Start wherever your first bullet point is.
Sure. I mean, I pretty much wanted to start just like explaining my family because there's the larger church culture, but the family is where it always starts. So for me, my family was very much serious Catholics even before, because unlike you, we didn't grow up with the FSSP. I didn't grow up with the FSSP. I went to my local Catholic church up through like fourth grade. Um, we were taught sort of the standard stuff. I'm sure I learned it. I don't really remember that far back, but like I'm sure we learned all the standard stuff. But I do remember that my grandfather, who Kevin, he was specifically never satisfied with the sort of level of religiosity at the local Catholic Church and at most Novus Ordo parishes that he had encountered. Things like you wouldn't necessarily, if you believed in the real presence, you wouldn't do things the way that you do when distributing communion or, things like that. I'm sure traditional Catholics will be familiar with the contentions. So he had discovered the chapel, the FSSP chapel that Kevin's family had helped found. And then after, oddly enough, because of this current climate, but after a sort of vaccine thing at my local Catholic school, there was some like controversy about a chickenpox vaccine and like whether or not it had used like ingredients from
Stem cells or something.
something like that. Yeah. And so vaguely, this is all when I was a kid, so I could be misremembering things, but that, to my impression, that was part of the reason they were like, I don't really know if we want you to go to this school. And then they made one of the gym teachers into the religion teacher, and they were like, that's it, that's the last straw, we're done. We're going to a real Catholic church, we're going to actually take this seriously. And I remember when I first went to the chapel, I was convinced that everyone would speak Latin fluently and like all classes would be held in Latin, and I'm like, I don't speak Latin fluently, I don't know how this is going to work. But it obviously wasn't. And so in fourth grade is when I joined. And I know you talked a lot about the young earth creationism you were raised with. For me, I was not raised that way. So like I was obsessed with dinosaurs specifically, like my whole life. So I would know all the facts, like 65 million years ago, that's when the asteroid hit, and all this different Cretaceous period, Triassic period, all these different things. I was obsessed. And so I remember distinctly in fourth grade, the teacher's son, she invited him down to like give us all like a fun pop quiz of interesting fun facts. I don't remember any of the tests except that one of the questions was like, what's the real age of the earth? And one was like 6,000 years old and one was 65 million years old. And the correct answer was not an option. And I just remember being so confused as a little fourth grader, being like, well, it has to be more than 65 million because that's when the dinosaurs died. So, and he was all like, oh, they don't teach you this in schools, but it's really only 6,000 years old because of the Bible math and all this stuff. And I was like, what are you talking about? And that was like when I got introduced to the concept. And obviously, like, I think through sixth grade for me, when we were in class together, we were fully young creationists, like Adam and Eve riding a brontosaurus in our science book. things like that. And I remember sort of struggling with that aspect because it had never been part of religion for me for the longest time, and then suddenly it was, and it didn't really mesh. And then I know you've talked about how there was a priest who was not FSSP, but was interested in the Latin Mass, and he had joined the parish. And he had a degree in, I think, physical chemistry. He had a PhD, I think, in physical chemistry.
Yes. So I made that episode where I talked about that
Yeah.
priest, and I think I said master's degree
You
or
did,
something.
yes.
And I learned after the fact it is in fact not just one PhD. I think it's a PhD.
Really?
It's like a PhD in physical chemistry, and
Right.
then another degree. Maybe the second degree was like a master's degree in. But there's definitely one PhD in physical chemistry, and then there's another degree. Obviously though, he also has like the doctorate of religion or whatever that degree is in
Sure,
in theology too. From
Right.
and he got that one at like Yale or something.
No
yeah,
way.
yeah. So
Wild.
When I made the video, I tried to make him sound as impressive as I thought he was, and I was underestimating him in my video.
He's very smart.
So yeah, very smart.
To this day, I'm never going to be, I'm never going to be convinced otherwise. He's a very smart man. But yeah, so he came in sort of on I'm not a crusade, that's a charged word, but he came in with sort of like, he found out that we were learning this stuff, and he was like, what are you talking about? None of this is going to stand. And I remember he had a seminar. I don't know because so there was always like a homeschooled sort of culture at the chapel. Not everyone went to the school that was offered by the church. And I was friends with a lot of the kids who were more part of that homeschool group, so I was sort of tied into things. And I do remember one event Father the priest did. He put on like a literal PowerPoint presentation explaining why evolution is not contrary to the church's teaching and why it's okay to believe that the earth is not 6,000 years old. And he had to teach all of the like parents and families at the school this, and I remember it was contentious to say the least, but he did that. I'm impressed by that still. But yeah, that was sort of the next stage, but that kind of got ironed out once he arrived, so I didn't have too much issues from then on. But I will say personally, I know in your videos, Kevin, you didn't necessarily, you kind of stuck to like the philosophical issues that you saw with the church that you sort of came to from a logical standpoint. And I definitely have those too. That's definitely part of my journey, but I don't want to be dishonest and leave out the emotional and other parts that were as important in the journey for me as just the pure philosophy of it. So I do remember in 5th and 6th grade, that around that time, you're starting to sort of grow up, puberty hits, normal sexual development happens. And part of the way we were always taught, because it was so hush hush about everything details wise with all of that, you kind of have this, you're growing up, you have these feelings, you have natural feelings, you're nothing crazy, but to you, they feel like the most depraved things you could ever imagine, because you have no concept that everyone else is feeling or doing the same things. And so I remember for years, just being like convinced I was the most awful person. And the weirdest thing, I'm openly gay now. I'm happy with my identity. I was not even aware that was an issue at the time. At the time, I thought everyone felt that way. I just assumed that was what people felt, And it for me, it was like the sin aspect of like, oh, you're having impure thoughts, and that's a sin, and you can't have those. And so this thing started to happen where you commit a sin by thinking something, because that's very clearly a part of Catholic doctrine, that thought crimes are a thing. Mm-hmm. And that can happen almost without knowing. Obviously, strictly speaking, the thought isn't the sin, it's the persistence and the entertaining of the thought. But to a 5th grader, and even to me now, I'm not exactly sure where that line is and how that can be determined. And as someone who has an anxious disposition, that did not sort of build towards something nice for me. So I ended up getting into this sort of spiral of, I would commit thought crime sins, and they would sort of pile up. And then the idea of going to confession with these priests that I was close with, friends with, they came over to our houses, that we were, it was a real community. So there was a closeness there. Having to sort of bare your soul to that extent was terrifying. And sort of this thought that once you worked up that courage to do that in confession, bare your soul, get all your sins cleansed, awesome. And then like the next day it's all back. It's just sort of an endless recursive loop that you can't really do anything to stop. And that sort of built up in me this sort of extreme fear of hell because I was convinced that there was nothing I could do essentially to escape it because I just was so abnormally depraved that no one could ever understand. There's a lot for a fifth grader to have to struggle with, I guess.
Yeah, and
I don't know if this is something you experienced.
Well, I'm certain that you experienced it worse than the average Colby kid, but I imagine that like this thought crime thing was pretty universal from like a Colby kid perspective. I distinctly recall one day doing what like a normal fourth or fifth grader does or whatever and playing with like plastic swords and stuff. And I have a distinct memory of looking at the sword and like thinking to myself, like, I'm acting out like violence. Like this is a sin. And I like put the sword down in disgust with myself. And I was like, I have to confess this. And I was like 10.
Oh, wow.
So just the level of scrupulosity, there's your SAT word of the day. But the trad movement has this way of making children hyper scrupulous. And I'm positive that it was worse for you than it was for me and for the average Colby kid. But I'm also positive that the average Colby kid experienced a way worse level of scrupulosity than normal Catholics.
It's so funny that you bring up scrupulosity because that was specifically also something we were told was a sin, being scrupulous.
I know.
And so I remember thinking that, like, am I being scrupulous? Is this another sin? So honestly, for what happened for me was it became so overwhelming that I just didn't go to confession, or I would end up going to confession and just making up sins. Because to my mind, I'm like, well, it's obviously now I'm not getting anything forgiven. I'm just tacking another sin on top. But what's one more sin? I'm already doomed for one of them, and the punishment is the same for one sin as it is for 500.
Yeah.
So, well, I was always like, I'll get to it later.
Yeah.
And that's sort of bred this anxiety constantly in my life.
Yeah. Jason said that he confessed one time that he was envious of his art professor for going to Europe. Jason, I don't think that's it. Yeah, I don't find that any more embarrassing than the things that I confessed. I confessed like the stupidest stuff, and I absolutely made up sins, like just to confess something. Because I remember thinking like, well, I didn't really like disobey my parents this week, but like, what else am I gonna say? So I guess I'll just say that I disobeyed my parents 10 times.
The go-tos were like, I was mean to my brother and I disobeyed my parents.
Right.
Those were like the go-tos. But no, it was also made worse for context because as part of the school curriculum, I guess is the word, we would do weekly confessions as classes. And there was never you have to go to confession, but if everyone else in your class is going to confession, like, you have to go.
And the trad movement, at least the way that we grew up, had a very funny way of like, you don't have to, but you have to.
You do.
Like there's.
Well, I think in any situation where it's such an insular, tight-knit community like that, a lot can be put on you without direct command, just through social conformity pressure.
Yes.
So that was a big part of it.
The social pressure in that.
And that's not a Catholic thing. That's just a insular society thing.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Amish feel the same way.
Oh yeah.
And that's why like Rumspringa, like 90 whatever percent, like return after. Like I get it. I get it. Like, and obviously I'm not saying that I had it as bad as the Amish, but
sure, no.
But I get the insular community kind of hold that happens when you grow up that way.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was sort of the base level as I was getting older. And then once we got to like middle school, basically, that's when that priest that we talked about earlier. Oh,
cat tax. Sorry, I have to.
Kitty.
It's a rule. Sorry, Colin. I didn't
I
didn't
would
mean to
grab my
interrupt.
60-pound dog and bring her out here, but I don't think she would appreciate it. But yeah, that same priest we were talking about earlier, with all the degrees, he took the religious education for middle schoolers like very seriously. We did 1 year that was, we're going to read the whole Bible front to back, which for Catholics is like, what? You're going to read the Bible? Like, okay, sure. Um, and then the next year it was apologetics, church history, and then other religions, which that's a whole
And
video.
that was my 8th grade year,
Yes.
was because I distinctly remember apologetics class.
Yes, that was our middle school, because our it was a very small school, so 7th and 8th grade were one room, same teachers. So
And just for context, also I'll say what's up, Nick. For context, Calion and I were 1 grade apart,
yeah,
so we would be in the same classroom as one another every
other
other year because of the way that like there weren't enough kids for like all of 8th grade to have an 8th grade classroom. So 7th and 8th were together.
I
5th
think
and
it's
6th
more
were
that there
together.
weren't enough teachers than it was kids.
Oh, that might be.
It's more the teachers, because from experience they will teach like, I mean, 1 kid in a class if they have a teacher for it.
Okay, that makes sense.
I took biblical Greek in high school.
Really? Wait, who taught that?
Father Boyd.
Father Boyd can.
He
Wow.
had like a Koine Greek primer. I was like, because it's structurally similar to Latin in a lot of, not always, obviously. There's an article you have to learn how to conjugate and decline, but I mean, it was within the same realm. So we were, yeah, he was teaching me, and then years later 2 other people started.
We might not have planned on getting into the apologetics that we're taught.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think, yeah. Do you want to kind of explain it?
So for the middle school perspective, he kept it pretty broad strokes. He basically boiled it down to the 3 big questions that you have to sort of prove in order to make your case good. There's the first one, which is, does God exist? You have to prove that. And then it's, okay, well, is Jesus Christ God? And then, is the Catholic Church the one true church? Sort of a succession of things you have to prove, which, I mean, looking back, that's very simplified, but I mean, essentially not entirely incorrect. Like, those are probably the 3 most important claims that you would want to prove if you could. And I think most people on like YouTube for sure will talk about the first one. Essentially, it's like the big one people talk about. It's like the theism atheism divide. So that's sort of been done to death. We learned all the basics, argument from causation. It was a lot of Thomistic stuff mostly.
That's what I was going to say, is that all of the theism debate was pretty much just.
Although I will say, being a science educated person, he did bring up a lot of specifically arguments from complexity and things like that. I do remember specifically being taught about like the complexity of an eye and how that can't evolve, which is not true. But that was what we were taught. It was one of the things, not one of the main arguments. I don't think anyone ever thought it was the most convincing, but it sort of ties into, which one of Paul's letters is it where he's like, God is apparent from the beauty of the world around us. And I think his way of explaining that was through that, like the complexity of biological systems. So sure, that was one of the ones. And then for the Christ question, I do remember a lot of it hinged on sort of proving that Christ claimed to be God, and then sort of the like
liar lunatic Lord, right? Yeah,
exactly. Very, very that. It was pretty much, did he claim to be God? And then that was the only thing they really shot out, was like liar, lunatic, Lord, and therefore God. And then the last one, I honestly don't remember the proofs for the last one, which is kind of funny because I don't know how they're going to get to it.
If I remember correctly, I think it was the whole like, I am Peter and upon this rock I build my church thing.
Okay. Right.
And then like, can we like draw a line of succession back to Peter? Yes, we can. Therefore, like the church that has the line of succession back to Peter is the one that wins. And like, oh, hey, look, it just so happens that we are the one who, I'm pretty sure that's how that one went.
Okay, that's probably why I don't remember, because they didn't spend as much time on it for sure.
Yeah, definitely not. But
I remember it was only a third of the year was apologetics, or more like, I don't know, maybe like a half. And then there was a lot of church history that we were taught.
And didn't we?
Selective edited church history.
Yeah, yes.
But yes,
Didn't we also do counter apologetics? Because I
a
remember
bit.
distinctly one class where pretty much all we did was
Yes.
like I'm not defending this. We just made fun of Mormons for like an
Oh
entire
no, so
class.
I'm getting there. So
Okay.
basically what we did was first part of the year, biggest chunk apologetics. And then we did church history where we sort of went through the martyrs. He talked a bit about he talked a lot about Arianism as that was a big one for him, was talking about Arianism, and I think Docetism too. He didn't really get into like Gnosticism or Manichaeanism or anything like that. He pretty much started after that. Went through that a little bit, and then we basically at the end of the year, I think he just finished early and was like, let's talk about some other religions, which in reality just meant let's make fun of other religions for how dumb they are, which, glass houses and all that. But that's what we did. We made fun of Mormonism, we made fun of Islam, we made fun of Jehovah's Witnesses.
And
I could keep going.
and at the time I didn't think that this was weird. At the time I was like, like, hey, like, I'll be on the dog pile. Like I love this because I was
Sure, yeah.
I was
Well,
12 or 13,
it all sounded silly to us because from when you believe that the way the world really is on a metaphysical level, well, all these people are just foolish for making up these stories. They're so crazy.
Yeah, and I distinctly remember making fun of the Mormons for like
Yes.
holy underwear. And then
Yes.
I also remember not at the time, but like years later, like wearing a scapular and
Oh yeah,
being like, wait a minute, isn't this holy underwear? Like,
pretty much. I mean, that was the other part of the church history. It was church history in terms of like, here are like 3 big heresies you can learn about, and then it was like Marian apparitions, a lot of mystical apocalyptic prophecies, which was interesting, and I don't really know why that was a big part of it because it's not a really Catholic thing, but sure. And specifically like scapulars, miraculous medals, things like that. Like we learned a lot about sacramentals. That's what it is. Yeah, they're called sacramentals. We learned a lot about those and like their origins and how they actually worked, sort of legally in a canon law kind of sense. I don't know if you remember this, but in 6th grade, I distinctly remember because like the whole thing with the scapular is that if you die while wearing one, you won't go to hell. And I remember being
motorcycle.
like, wait a minute. Yes, the motorcycle.
I remember.
Yes. They would always tell the story like, don't think you can get out of like actually being holy because one time someone was wearing a scapular and thought, well, as long as I'm wearing this, it doesn't matter what I do, and rode a motorcycle really fast and crashed, and they found him dead on the road, and the scapular was like 100 feet away in a tree. So God always makes it work out or something. I distinctly remember that.
Which is kind of hilarious because it's like,
Very.
wait, so the scapular doesn't actually do anything yet.
When you actually think about it, it's like, well, it prevents you from going to hell if you do everything that prevents you from going to hell already.
Right.
Which, like, okay, like, why do I need this?
And if you don't stop doing the things that will make you go to hell, you just simply won't die until the scapular is not on your body anymore. And
Exactly.
It's like, wait a minute, like.
I do remember, like, one time someone explained, like, well, what it really means is that you'll get an opportunity to go to confession before you die. Which, like, okay. Sure. Isn't that what last rites are for? Like,
yeah. Nick says, I like my scapular, but it's easy to treat it as a magic pendant.
it's a lot of sacramentals.
Yeah.
It kind of.
Something that I'll steal from Calion is the observation that a lot of like these kind of more trad Catholic like rituals and just like holy items and stuff are almost pagan-y, like especially when you stop treating them the way that the church officially tells you to treat them, because I think that a lot of people probably treat the scapular more pagan-y than the church intends you to treat your scapular, if that makes sense.
It's actually very interesting. So this is kind of a tangent. It's not really related to my story specifically, but so a lot of those are tied to what's usually called folk Catholicism. There's as many types of folk Catholicism as there are, cultures. But I think folk Catholicism is the coolest thing ever. Like I remember one of my friends being like, "Oh yeah, my great grandmother would have visions of the future," and she was like a big deal in her local parish until the priest was like, "You should probably stop doing that," and things like that. And like I know a lot of, especially from Latin America, there's a lot of traditions that are essentially the same as what you would call witchcraft, but are just done through
Yeah.
the power of God. Which,
Right.
you know, from a sociological perspective, there's not much difference. From the Catholic Church perspective, there is, of course, because, you know, when you believe in like the one true church and all that. But from the standpoint of what is religion, what is magic, from a sociological perspective, it's very similar to like transubstantiation or all these other things. So there's a lot of overlap there, actually, between like what you might consider paganism or witchcraft or magic and just standard religious practice, especially Catholics, because they're so ritual heavy.
And I'll even argue that the line gets blurry sometimes because you
Very.
look at certain saints like Saint Margaret of Cortona or Saint
Yes.
Bernadette Subaru, like these saints who were literally mystics, like the kind of
Oh
saints
yeah.
that Father Boyd, the priest who from our chapel, that he really liked.
Yep.
So it's like a,
Absolutely.
you
There's a
know,
lot of that. I mean, there's a reason they call things like Marian cults that grow up around different apparitions. Not meant to be a derogatory term. It's just sort of a sociological term for the particular veneration of a specific person or object because of its assumed magico-religious significance.
there are contemporaries to the Guadalupe apparitions
Yeah.
who hated the Guadalupe apparitions and referred to them as the cult at Tepeyac, because
Yep.
Tepeyac was the name of the place where the apparition occurred. So, cult of Tepeyac.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a big part of Catholicism. It's part of the DNA for sure. And I think part of that is because one of Catholicism's biggest strengths, I would argue, is its syncretic ability. Because I mean, when you actually look at the DNA of what Catholicism is, it's a lot of Greek stuff. It's a lot of Jewish, mysticism, and there's a lot of layers. It's not just the Gospels. There's a lot of layers that make up Catholicism, and a lot of them are sourced from places you might not expect, like Roman mystery religions and things like that. I mean, even if it's sort of from within the church's perspective, like as a sort of this is a divine revelation, you have to sort of agree that a lot of the philosophical framework that makes up tradition is not derived from Jewish culture or purely biblical sources. It comes from a lot of different cultures and practices.
Nick is highlighting Saint Aidan and saying that it's. I don't know Saint Aidan in
I'm not
particular,
aware.
but I definitely do know about plenty of saints who like. I don't know
Oh,
necessarily
oh,
about.
I have one.
Oh, okay.
Saint Bridget. Saint Bridget is there's an Irish goddess named Bridget, whose feast day is the same as Saint Bridget. Um, she had a sacred well in a particular spot in Ireland, and so it's thought that to sort of co-opt or reorient traditional pagan practices, it was sort of like, oh, there was a
Hmm.
nun named Bridget, and now she's a saint. I don't know if there's actually a nun named Bridget. There may be, but the saint day for Saint Bridget and like the practices associated with Saint Bridget's Day in Ireland and stuff are much older than any saint that may have existed.
Interesting. I was going to bring up
There's
like
a lot
Saint.
of times like that.
Yeah, I know Saint Christopher is largely like considered mythical today.
Right.
If you read the earliest accounts of Saint Christopher, he was a giant.
Yep.
Like, okay.
Oh yeah.
So
No, there's quite a lot of examples of different local deities that sort of find themselves with a saint in front of their name. Um, it's fascinating. From a historical point of view, it's very interesting. I love all that stuff, but I mean, as a Catholic, it becomes problematic pretty quick.
it does. It does. We got derailed, I think.
Actually, a little
But
bit. Sorry.
I said that we like derailment around here. So,
Yeah, of course.
uh, uh, CJ Rice wants to let everybody know that he's not mythical.
Good to know.
I believe you. I believe you, Christopher. I don't think you're mythical. Um, but so I think before the derailment, we were talking about like kind of the seventh and eighth grade
Yeah,
apologetics
apologetics
class.
introduction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I will say for me personally, around that time was also the time. So it's the time when I'm learning the specifics of the religion and sort of the first whys. You know, instead of just the what's, it's the why. Why do we believe this?
Mhm.
Um, and it's at the same time that I sort of had to acknowledge the fact that I was a gay person. Um, which it sounds weird to have to say that because like shouldn't you just know? But like I said, I thought everyone felt that way, and it was just like girls were fun and nice, and I mean, I would like to have a best friend girl that I would hang out with all my life. So like, sure, marriage seems fine. That was my perspective. Um,
It's funny,
but it
but
was
it's also
like
really sad. Like,
that's what I thought. I don't know. It just never occurred to me that there was a difference out there. Um, but there's also that sort of on a subconscious level, you're like, maybe not. I remember distinctly, viscerally, in like, I think it was in that class about, oh no, you know what? It was the year after. So you were already in high school because that was the year we did the Bible. Um, and I guess there's a in the story of Cain and Abel, it talks about how the blood of Abel cries out to God from the earth for vengeance. Um, and he was like, well, there are specific sins that are so heinous, that are so horrible, that they cry out to God for vengeance. And he was like, one of them is obviously like fratricide, like killing your family member. Um,
depriving a worker of his wages is one of them,
there
which
you go.
is
Wow, based.
yeah, I know. It's like it's
The
anyway.
whole where did usury go as a sin debate is a very interesting
Yeah.
topic for another day. But um, yeah, so I remember specifically it was like, well, homosexuality is one of the sins that is so heinous that it cries out to God for vengeance from the earth. And I just remember like the like panic that would grip me when things like that would happen. I'd just be like, oh, it's a good thing I'm not I'm lucky, which obviously I was, but at the time it's like hard to acknowledge that when that's what it means.
Right.
Um so yeah, that was definitely a big problem for me growing up from pretty much sixth grade, I think, through all of like the first year of high school. Not a great time mentally for me, for sure. Mostly because of that, like learning more about, how sin works mechanically and what that implies or means for my state mentally. It was not a good thing. And then just learning as I sort of realized that, oh, I don't like girls, I like guys like this. What does that mean for my future? Not for my right now, because at the time I was a committed Catholic. I was not going to be like gallivanting off with like strangers or whatever. But in a traditional community that's very geared towards marriage, family, kids, what does that future look like for me? And I remember there's a Catholic organization that's part of like the church. It's called Courage.
Yep.
And the whole thing is they're like, well, it's okay to be gay because you don't choose that, but everyone who's not married is called to be celibate, and guys can't marry guys, so we're all just called to be celibate forever. And I think for me that never really resonated, mostly just because it wasn't about like sex for me then. It wasn't a sexual urge. It's like, well, I'll never have a family, I'll never have a partner, I'll never have the ability to do all those things that we're told are the most meaningful parts of life. Like I remember growing up, it was taught like the best thing you could do is be a priest, and the second best thing you could do is be married. So it's like, well, where does that leave me? I don't know. Um,
I
and
remember having that instilled in me so much that I distinctly remember only ever really thinking that there were two options, which was
right,
priest or, it's fatherhood or fatherhood. It's one of the two fatherhoods. Um,
exactly.
and my confirmation name is John Vianney because I thought I wanted to be a priest.
Yep.
But like, I oscillated back and forth, as kids do, right? But I only oscillated back and forth between those two. It was either priest or go get some kind of job and bring home enough money, but that's not really your vocation. That's just what you do for money.
Yeah.
And then you spend your money on getting married and raising a family.
I distinctly remember a lot of around this time and like in high school thinking like maybe I should just become a priest because like, finding a job and figuring out what you want to do with your life alone was just such a daunting prospect for me. I was like, well, maybe I'll just become a priest and then have someone tell me where to go and I'll deal with that. But obviously I wasn't that committed, so I never really tried. But it was something I thought about just because, like you said, fatherhood or fatherhood, and that seemed like the more attainable of the two for me. But yeah, that was pretty much where it was as I was leaving middle school and going into high school. That's where our paths diverged again because you went to public high school.
Yeah.
I was a little jealous because for context, the high school at this church, my first year it was 11 people total in one room.
It's a lot.
Oh yeah, second year was 7. For my class, it was just me and one other person. So, Yeah, and then I should probably also mention that it was a very small world, and they didn't have a lot of talent pool for teachers, just because they didn't have a lot of money to pay people, and it was a lot of. My mom likes to say it's a labor of love, more than it is sort of a job. Um, yeah, I agree. I agree,
Yeah.
Christopher.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my my mother was actually a teacher in the high school. She taught English literature. She did a very good job. Um, my grandfather was the math teacher. He did a less good job.
He taught me algebra in 8th grade because I took
He did.
double. So your grandma and your grandpa
Yeah, my
taught me.
grandmother was our middle school teacher,
Yeah.
and then she became the principal after you left.
Didn't she
Oh wait, she
become
was the principal. You're
principal
right. The whole
in
thing.
my 8th grade year?
You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but she was running the school,
Yep.
and she was our teacher, and then my grandfather and my mom were my other teachers in high school. So it was very close. I tell this story to people now, and they're like, "So you were homeschooled?" And I'm like, "Well, no, I had to wear a uniform and drive 20 minutes every morning, so it was worse."
It's like a homeschool co-op,
It
really.
is.
Because like think about the like, and so my mom would substitute teach. She didn't
She did.
teach, but she would substitute. And my grandma used to teach at that school before I got
I didn't know
there.
that.
Yeah, she taught for the 6th grade.
Awesome.
And my grandparents helped to found that church. So realistically, this is like a really small group of families. Like we're talking about like probably grand total something like 25 families or something like that. Like all
That
in.
sounds right. Sounds
Um,
right. Big families.
Big families. So, we're talking a couple hundred, like maybe 400 people or whatever, like total.
Right.
Um, but that's it. Like that's not a very big community when you think about it.
And yeah, I should put this in here that everything was centered around that community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think once you guys went to public high school, it was a little less maybe for you guys because you were able to make friends that weren't tied to the church. I don't know how that went for you, but
That was my first time making like real friends who weren't the trad Catholic. Was high school.
yeah, for me that it didn't quite work out that way because I was just sort of in the room. I did eventually get a job, and that was where I like met people who weren't Catholic, and it was like, oh, like okay.
They're not monsters.
But yeah, so in high school specifically, we started getting really more into like the nitty gritty of apologetics, like different proofs for each of those three different questions we talked about, and then learning like the real nitty gritty of how the religion worked. Like, what were the sacraments? What do they actually mean? Like, what does it mean that it's an efficacious sacrament? Like all these different things like that, and different types of sin, how sin works, why does sin work this way, and then there was a lot of just sort of we would have a lot of questions. Obviously, we were not afraid to ask them. So much so, we asked so many questions that they actually called a different priest in to yell at us for being too irreligious. Did I ever, you know, I told you that?
Oh, I didn't know that. And also, I should
Yeah.
say that I did still take classes at Colby throughout high school. I took
Oh,
religion classes on,
okay.
and like some of the deacons would teach them. They
Oh,
were like
okay.
once a week on like Saturdays. But
Interesting. I
um,
didn't know that.
yeah, but we never got yelled at for being too inquisitive, which is
Well, we
very
asked a
Catholic.
lot of questions. Well, some people were like, "Oh, well, if abortion's wrong, we should bomb abortion clinics, right?" Yeah, like straight up, like some of the harder hitting questions
Ooh,
than you might
wow.
expect. And I remember being like, "No, you shouldn't do that." And the priest was obviously like, "No, you shouldn't do that." But I remember distinctly, sort of from my own journey, one thing that I remember being very impactful was we were talking about the reasons like for why being gay is wrong, and this is where they brought up teleology, not under that name. I didn't actually know that name until I watched your channel,
Oh,
which is
okay.
funny. I did not know the official term for it, but yeah, they talked about like the ends of acts and things like that, and this is the only time they ever brought it up, by the way.
Just,
Hi,
just,
Sky.
just what?
That's my friend Sky. Yeah.
Hey, Sky.
Yeah, fun fact, there was actually someone at the church who did bomb an abortion clinic, did jail time for it. They weren't like on the run or anything, but yeah, that's sort of the
Yep.
crowd you move in.
Yep.
um
It was the 80s, so it was before
yes.
we were born, but might have
Yes.
been early 90s or something, but still, it was definitely before you and I were born, but not by a whole lot.
Interestingly, he turned himself into the police because his bishop told him to, which is fun. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Look at that. All right.
So anyway, yeah, that was the only time we ever really brought up teleology, was to be like, well, this is why gay people shouldn't be gay, because of teleology. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, wait, how does that work? Um,
That's the only context that teleology ever comes up in Catholic circles, and it makes
yep.
me so mad because like
Well,
diet soda is an abomination to the telos
well,
of
no, Kevin, because it's still nourishing you a
diet
little
soda's
bit.
not. Diet soda's 0 calorie. No
No, no,
nourishment at all.
it's nourishing. They'll think of something.
They
But
will.
I distinctly remember bringing this up. I was like, well, what about like junk food? And they were like, well, it's still it's technically nourishment. It technically does nourish your body, so it fulfills the telos. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Um, I'll get into like my actual philosophical objections to these things later. I'm just trying to go through like the story first. But yeah, this is like, I was starting to, obviously I had all these feelings, and it was already hard. And then I was like, okay, well, here are the answers for why I'm not supposed to do these things. And I was very motivated to figure it out why, because obviously this was a lot. It was rough on me. And I know there's like the my yoke is easy and my burden light thing. And I was always like, that's not really true. As a kid, I remember being like, that doesn't seem to fit my experience.
Right.
Um, yeah, for me, it was never like, I don't believe in God. That I never really questioned. It was like,
Sorry, I just thought that was funny. The only teleology I like is sweet
oh,
tea. I agree.
I like sweet tea.
Me too.
That's a good one. But yeah, it was mostly like a lot of the sort of moral reasonings and things like that hell and the problem of evil started popping up, and I'd be like, well, I don't understand how. Like, I remember asking my parents, like, if a dad is backing up his truck and he doesn't notice that his 3-year-old child is behind him and he runs his child over, why is that allowed to happen? You can't say it's free will, because it wasn't something he intended to do. It wasn't like there was any fault there. It's just a sort of natural evil that occurs. And that the sort of question of natural evil was a big deal for me. And there were usually two answers that were given to me. It was either, well, that was his time, and it was whatever happened was sort of like God knew that it could turn into a good end. Like, murdering his child was going to be great for that dad somehow down the road, or that child, their kid, they go to heaven, it's fine. um, and the other answer was usually, well, original sin messed up paradise, so now the world has natural evil in it. And that brought me to like my next thing, which was, original sin doesn't make any sense as a concept. It doesn't fit with any other moral framework that the church has. It just sort of sits there, and everything hinges on it, and it doesn't make sense. And from that, you get to heaven and hell and free will, and none of those concepts seem to mesh for me. Like, it was sort of a big circle I kept going around in. Like, well, if we needed to be able to choose evil because of free will, then how does heaven work? And if you can be in heaven with free will and not sin, then why couldn't we have just been made that way? Like, why did we have to be made on earth? Like, there's so many like implications of these concepts that sort of didn't make sense to me. So from my supremely motivated space to understand why this is the way it was, it didn't make sense to me. Like, the more I learned, and the more I learned about sin and how sin works, that literally everything is a sin. Like, I'm not really exaggerating, because putting yourself into an occasion of sin willingly is a sin. So that's sort of like a step removed becomes a sin, and you can sort of make that an infinite loop of sin. Eventually it becomes paralyzing. And that paralyzing state is, as you said, scrupulosity, and that's a sin as well. So, because once you sort of make thought a moral crime, a moral good or evil, you sort of open the door. Like, you can't really close that.
It,
So
it
yeah,
you start getting like infinite loops at that point once you let thought crime
yeah.
into the equation.
There are all these like issues. Obviously, I was struggling to understand how any of it worked. And I specifically remember one thing about, near occasions of sin. That was a
And
big deal.
it's a sin to put yourself in a near occasion of sin.
I distinctly remember the catechism that explained this. It was an old book from like the 50s. So it was like, oh, there's a store. It's got like magazines with girls' dresses on it. We could go into that store, but then we'd be tempted to look at those magazines. We better not walk in that store.
I remember that. And Jason, with the astute observation that God did have to start all over, because we
I
kept
remember
reproducing with angels and making giants. Yeah.
I like didn't find that out until college, and I was like, no one told me there were like angel human giant hybrids in the Bible. I would have been much more hooked if you made that case to me. I don't know. I think
Yep.
Catholics should really. Angels are a whole thing in Catholicism. I think don't get enough attention, but that's a whole separate video for another time. But um, this specific circumstance, I remember thinking about transubstantiation, and I just could not wrap my head around it. It did not make sense to me because the concept of like a Platonic ideal noumenal world didn't make sense to me. Like I didn't understand what that would even mean, or and what it just seemed like such a cop out to be like, oh, it changes, but not in any way that can be detected or measured or observed or proved or anything. It's like, well, okay, sure. And I remember thinking to myself, like, desperately, like, well, if I don't believe this, I can't be Catholic, and if I'm not Catholic, I can't go to heaven, and therefore I have to believe this. But it doesn't make sense to me. And when I think of believing something, I am convinced of it. I was not convinced of it, but I knew I had to believe it. And so I remember worrying, being like, can I just choose on some abstract level that I accept this? And is that enough for God, or is that not real belief? Like, does God not accept that? And I don't really know the answer to that from a Catholic point of view now. Like, I actually don't. I don't know what a Catholic would say, so I'd be curious if anyone could answer that for me, because that was something I struggled with. Like, what level of
Nick,
belief is needed?
Daniel, I have a feeling that, and I don't want to put words in Daniel's mouth, but the conversations that we've had, um, I think that Daniel would kind of be okay with this idea of like a Catholic atheist. So I think that his
Hmm,
idea of like what level of belief is needed would be pretty darn minimal.
gotcha.
But that's Daniel is a unique case. So
Sure.
probably not representative of the Catholic Answers brand Catholics, for instance. So,
Sure.
so you know, pretty different.
But yeah, all these sort of issues were coming up for me, and like a lot of the issues around, like, this is such a stereotype, I guess, but this sort of sexual morality of the church, and that's the first response to that is always like, oh, well, you just wanted to go have sex and you couldn't hack it with the church, and so that's what it is. But that's really not what it was. I was a really good kid. Like, I didn't do anything like that. I was super straight laced. I didn't drink. I didn't do anything like that. Um, it just did not make sense to me, like, logically. It did not follow. And I remember distinctly in class, we were sort of doing that Socratic, like, well, asking questions about the implications of different moral teachings. And I remember asking, like, okay, so if you have a gay couple, they're together, they adopt a kid, they're a family, and then they convert, they realize, oh, okay, Catholicism's the true religion. What happens with the kid? Like, what do you? And I remember, like, they were like, well, that they'd have to find a different family for that kid because it's not good to be and I'm like, that just doesn't make sense to me. Like, that does not follow. um so that sort of, there are all these like moral therefores that did not mesh for me. um and as far as I knew, like, I wasn't even, I wasn't aware of biblical textual criticism. I wasn't aware of like historical issues with different things. Like, none of that. It was all just like, this doesn't make sense, like, philosophically, morally, logically. So that was all sort of going on um, in high school. Um, so I don't know. You might want to put like a content warning if you ever upload this, just because this is going to get a little real. But
Well, this will live on YouTube. So like the stream obviously is
I
live
know.
right now, and that's all the comments.
Sure.
Um, but I can like edit in the future. So like I can
That's what I'm
like
saying. You might want to put something in the description or something. But like,
okay.
I did I struggle a lot with like suicidal ideation and stuff. And I was very vocal about it too. Like, I remember once in religion class, like, damn, if suicide wasn't a sin, like, tomorrow, like, that shit not even hard. And they were just kind of like, that's not good. I'm like, looking back, I'm like, they should really have referred me to someone, or like, I don't know, like, that's not good.
Whoa. Yeah.
But like, I
Jeez.
would think about it like that. This like this expanse of future just like stretching in front of me that had nothing to look forward to. Nothing but just constant stress, constant stress that you were going to go to hell. And I'm like, well, I just want to go to confession, get it all out of my system, and then onto paradise, you know, like that's the way it is. But at that time, they were still like suicide is a sin, you know. It was still very much like if you commit suicide, you don't get a burial in the church, like all that stuff. I know that I believe that's different now, right?
I believe so, but I'm gonna be honest and say I don't know if anything has officially changed in terms of like. I think it's just kind of like like in practice
Okay.
it's changed. That's what I think.
As
But
far as I was aware, it was more like, well, they mental health was sort of taken into consideration more. That it's like, well, usually when you commit suicide, you're not in your right mind, so you can't be morally culpable.
yeah,
That wasn't the understanding I was raised with. So for me, it was like, well, I'm going to go to hell if I do that. So better not do that.
yeah. Um,
But there were
and
times that was the only thing that kept me like not doing that.
and obviously what I'm about to say pales in comparison to what you just talked about, but I do remember saying things like, "Man, I hope I get martyred."
Yeah. Oh yeah. Constantly.
Because I was like, hey, like, I don't have to live in this flesh bag anymore and I
Well,
just get to go
you
to
also
heaven
get you
immediately.
also get into purgatory, right? You get into this idea of purgatory, so that you die, and if you're in purgatory, like you made it, you're gonna go to heaven, but you could be there for like 1,000 years of like misery that could be like as bad as hell. It's just for only 1,000 years, and so the idea with martyrdom is that you skip all that and you go straight to heaven. So there was a sort of, well, it's better than like a moment of pain for death, and then you skip 1,000 years of purgatory. For me, though, I was like so desperate that I was like, I'll just get to purgatory, I'll be fine.
Oh, jeez.
Um, but yeah, it was
Ooh.
paralyzing, this like anxiety about the afterlife for me. So much so that like it would sort of baffle me, or like I wouldn't be able to understand when people weren't terrified of it, because it was just like, how are you not constantly afraid of this? Because that was also the other thing, like you know not the day nor the hour. I will come like a thief in the night. You know that whole thing. Like you could die at any moment. That was drilled into us like from a young age. Like it could be your moment at any time. And thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, it was rough. So into this soup of religious and mental health and stuff like that, anxieties going on. Um, I sort of developed like a crush, I guess I could call it, on someone else in the school, which is a very small school. So, um, and basically, what happened was I decided for some reason, looking back now, I think this was, well, I decided I should write a letter with all my feelings in it. Um, and as I was writing, it just sort of became a suicide note. Um, it wasn't my intention in the beginning, but that's sort of how it turned out. Um, and it sort of started in my brain like, oh, this would be a fun prank, like leave like an anonymous love letter and he'll freak out, but it doesn't make any sense. And the fact that it turned out to be like a suicide note, I'm pretty sure it was just, well, I have to say this, I have to let this out of myself somehow, I can't keep hiding it. um so yeah, I wrote this out. I thought about giving it to him, but I was like, no, that's a bad idea. So I put it in my backpack and forgot about it, honestly. So apparently this person went through my stuff and found it. It was not something I was intending or was aware of, but basically he brought it to his parents, who brought it to the administration of the school, which is my grandmother, and all the priests that were like very close with us. And she read out the letter to them, which was, a little embarrassing to look back on. I was not there, but yeah. And basically this was over at the end of the school year. um, I guess he had found it in like the spring, and then they waited a couple months, and then after school was over, they brought it. And the parents were like, "Well, this is because, you know, my parents were teachers and stuff, and we wouldn't want this to affect our son's grades." And it's like, this is a suicide note. Like, you need to. This is the serious thing. Like, if you find something like that, you need to report that and get that person help. Like that. That's not a. It's not okay to sit on that for months because you're worried about your kid's grades. Um, so that's a little odd. That's not a issue with like Catholicism or anything. It's just like a personal, like, I don't get it. But anyway, so because of that situation, that was kind of how I was outed to the church community at large. And as far as I know, there weren't really any other people that were gay. out and about at the church or had been outed or anything like that. Like, not that I
You're
was
the
aware
only
of.
one that I know of. Like to this
Yeah.
day, you're the only one.
But yeah, it was pretty bad. I distinctly remember one of the priests had been scheduled to hang out at our house the next day after that for dinner. And my parents were like, it's fine. He can still come over. So that was fun. But yeah, so I do remember one thing though, that apparently the parents who had brought this letter in, they like told the story to your mother, and her response was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for Colin," which like means a lot, and I still think about that a lot. So
And
Kevin's mom's a good person.
and
Less
for the
anyone's
record,
working.
my mom never told me any of this.
Oh, really?
You came out to me, I
Wow.
distinctly remember, over text. And
Oh my god, did I?
I was like, what? Like, I knew that you had left the high school at the end of your
Yeah.
sophomore year or freshman year?
Yep. Sophomore year.
Sophomore.
Sophomore year.
But the way that it was spun to me was that like I knew that you were smart, and I knew that you were going to CCM, and I knew that a lot of smart people went to. And I'm sorry, guys, CCM was a local
County college.
county college, and I don't know if it's this way in all states, but we grew up in the state of New Jersey, and you can finish your high school at a county college. And in fact, a lot of bright people do this, and they get like a bunch of college credits, and then they go
Worked
to
out well for me.
yeah, it sure did. So I didn't really question it. Like when I heard that you were going to CCM instead, I was like, okay, cool. Like good for Colin. Like good for Calion. Second time I made that mistake this stream.
It's fine. No worries.
It's not in the thumbnail. But I I didn't think anything of it because my mom never told me. So you know, everybody's family's got their own problems. But that's one thing I'll say. My mom did not tell. Nobody told me until you told me. And obviously, you know, you came out to me with I think a lot less fanfare than what you just described.
Once you kind of go through that, it's like, okay. I will say, like, people are like, oh my god, that's so rough, or I can't imagine. That kind of broke down a lot of my like, what if people find out, or what if this happens? Like, well, that already happened to me, so like, whatever. At this point,
you survived it. Like, hey, it doesn't get worse than that.
yeah. Well, it does. I don't want to minimize
Oh
other people's
yeah,
experience,
that's
but
yeah, very good
but
point.
yeah, it was pretty bad. They, it was asked not to return to school, um, and then I was like asked not to come back to choir. I was asked not to come back to the youth group. Things like pretty much every official. I had been there was like a summer camp for kids that I was like helping as like a camp counselor, and they were like, "Don't come back." So a lot of these things were sort of like, "Don't come back to this, don't come back to that," and that was all very much like the social aspect. I will say I didn't like lose any friends over it. No one that I was friends with was like no longer friends with me after this, which I appreciate. But yeah, it was not easy. It was really rough. For what it's worth, my parents, when they had like found out about like the fact that it was like a suicide note and there was like suicidal ideation going on, they were like, you're going to therapy. Like, you need medical help. But with the caveat that they were like, well, it has to be a Catholic therapist who will only do like Catholic approved therapy, because all these secular therapists are just going to tell you to, accept your sinful inclinations, and that's not going to actually help you, and so you need to go to like a Catholic therapist who's going to really tell you how it really is. And I'm not going to lie, that was probably the hardest part of all of it, was going to the therapist. So when I had come out to my parents, well, when my parents had found out, they'd been very, like, we still love you. You're still our son. Nothing's ever going to change that, which I very much appreciate. But my dad's first question was, "Oh, were you molested? Is this why you were this way?" Which, like, old stereotypes coming back. My mom was better because she had in college, I guess, been friends with a lot more gay people, so she wasn't as stereotypical about the whole thing. But I distinctly remember my dad was like, "Well, hey, do you think you want to pursue some like therapy to try to change this about yourself?" And you know, maybe it's something you want. And I remember my mom being like, absolutely not. That's not happening, which I appreciated, you know, because I did not want to go to conversion therapy. But sort of the therapy that they found for me ended up just kind of being conversion therapy. Um, like the therapist would just constantly be like, well, let's get to the root of why you think this way. And like, let's get to the root of they always say like same sex attraction. That's the term they
That's
always
right.
use. SSA.
SSA. Yeah.
Hmm. It's very clinical.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, let's get to the root of the same sex attraction. And like, why do you think you feel this way? And like, maybe that'll really help. Because ostensibly it was like, well, social anxiety and depression and things. But he was always like, well, I mean, let's get to the root of that, you know? And I was not happy. And we had to drive. The only one we could find, I guess, was in Connecticut. So we would drive like 2 hours
Whoa.
every Friday. Me and my mom up to this therapist for light conversion therapy, which
Light
was not fun.
conversion therapy.
Light
Jeez.
conversion therapy. Eventually, I did stop going though. I guess because at that time I was then at the county college. I was working at a job where there were a lot of other like non-Catholic people my age that I made friends with, and I sort of wasn't in that same emotionally vulnerable place anymore. And I started to get much more okay with myself and accepting of myself. And all of those doubts that I had had about religion didn't sort of go away through all of this. Like they were all there still. But I remember in college, like I met a Wiccan for the first time. And it was like immediately I was hardcore Catholic again, being like, whoa, what about this and this and this apologetic thing and this and that. And meanwhile, in myself, none of it was making sense to me anymore. But I was still like, blah, 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 I know better than you, you know, hear all these things. And that was, I think, a lot of it is that certainty, that feeling of I know everything, I know better than all these people. That was the hardest thing for me to let go of.
Same.
Not any of the other stuff.
I
But
had
yeah,
it,
so
I had it all figured out when I was 14.
exactly, it's a nice feeling.
Yeah, I felt
Except for
on
the
top
other
of the
stuff.
world. Yeah, right. Except for everything underneath.
But yeah, it became more and more apparent to me as I was getting older that intellectually I didn't really believe the same things that I used to about the first order philosophical principles of the church. Like, I mean, you've talked about that in your video. You have the same thing. It's like I don't really believe the same things that I used to. I probably would have still called myself Catholic at the time, but I distinctly remember this particular quote. I don't remember if it was in college or if it was at county college for me, but in the Screwtape Letters, which I mean most people probably know what that is, but in case you don't, it is a book by C.S. Lewis, which is styled as an older devil who is writing letters to his nephew on how to tempt mortals and get them to, you know, fall into hell. And there's a quote in it. I actually have it here. Do you mind if I read it?
Oh,
It was
yeah,
like,
no.
he's giving his nephew advice about what to do with this guy, and he says, the person can be made to take a positive pleasure in the perception that the two sides of his life are inconsistent. This is done by exploiting his vanity. He can be taught to enjoy kneeling beside the grocer on Sunday just because he remembers that the grocer could not possibly understand the urbane and mocking world that he inhabited on Saturday evening, and contrariwise, to enjoy the bawdy and blasphemy over the coffee with these admirable friends, all the more because he is aware of a deeper spiritual world within him which they cannot understand. You see the idea. The worldly friends touch him on one side, and the grocer on the other, and he is the complete, balanced, complex man who sees round them all. Thus, while being permanently treacherous to at least two sets of people, he will feel, instead of shame, a continual undercurrent of self-satisfaction. And that stuck in my head, and I was like, that's kind of me. That's where I'm at. And that's not a good spot to be in. I don't want to be self-satisfied, arrogant asshole. So I was like, I need to seriously look at myself and commit. And I can't just sit here in the middle and pretend I'm better than everyone, you know?
Can I make a confession?
Go for it.
I read the Screwtape Letters when I was probably like 14.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that line.
Yeah.
And I think it's because I was so arrogant that I was like,
Look, you look
that
Catholic.
idiot.
Yeah.
I've got it all figured out. Like he's
Yep.
like, I'm not like that guy.
Yep.
Even I was, but
Oh yeah. And this was definitely something I struggled. I for like the last 2 years of my like high school when I was at county, that I felt that really, and then even in like in college, like I would struggle with this a lot, just feeling like, well, I have all this background of philosophy and religion that I'm like, I know all this. And then I'm like, no, I don't. None of it's true. I don't believe it that it's true. This doesn't make me a better person or anything like that. I need to be honest with myself about what I actually believe in. So I really thought about what I believed. And for me, my family, I know you've talked about your family. They're religious to sort of the exclusion of everything else, including like politics and things like that. Like that's politics aren't really the driving force in their lives.
for my
Um,
family, yeah.
right. My family, they are like they are very politically engaged. Everything is always like filtered through that lens. Like I was reading Ann Coulter as a child, uh, Jonah Goldberg, Mark Levin, all these people. You know, I would listen to Rush Limbaugh every day after school, pretty much on the way home. Um, so for me, that sort of political belief structure was as much a part of the religious belief structure as everything else because they sort of informed each other so innately. So a lot of my serious thought process during college was thinking about political beliefs. And it's funny, Skylar, who messaged earlier, the what, um, they were a big influence on me in college, like just getting me to pop out of myself a little bit and think about things that I had taken for granted for a long time. And that sort of led naturally through, you know, political theory and stuff, but back to religion and philosophy. And I had known for a while that I didn't really believe it because it didn't make sense to me. But I really started to think um, about religion seriously. And you and I both went to a school with a large Indian immigrant population. So a lot of people I met there were people who were not Abrahamic religions at all, or also like I met Muslims for the first time. I met Hindus for the first time, and just talking to them about what they actually believed, not just what our eighth grade class making fun of religion said they believed, um, was fascinating. Especially talking to my friends who are Hindu, just like what the word religion means suddenly like expanded for me. You know, uh, it was crazy. Just like realizing that it doesn't have to be a prescriptivist, um, commandment based religion that requires you to believe in first order philosophical principles for it to be a religion. And it was sort of like, wait, like this can be religion? And so I personally started like really looking into like lots of different kinds of religion. Like I got really into Wiccanism for a while, and I'm still very like into all of like the occult magic and stuff. I just think it's cool. I love like learning about it. But it was something I like researched a lot of different religions. I thought about being Protestant, thought about being, you know, all these different things. But I sort of eventually settled into a pretty similar philosophical position that you're at with nominalism. Um, what's mereological nihilism? That one.
Yeah, that's another
Also,
one.
never heard that term until you brought it up, but
Um,
absolutely.
I don't know if I've told you this story. This is a college story.
Uh-huh.
But it's related to what you said about how like college was the first time that we kind of ran into like non-Abrahamic religions. Well,
Yes.
so this is actually like a story about Islam, so
Sure.
it is an Abrahamic religion,
But not Judeo-Christian.
right. So I was hanging out in the honors lounge, which is, you know, classic place to hang out.
Communal
And
area.
I had friends there who were so the town that I grew up in had a large like Dutch Reformed population, and a decent amount of the Dutch Reformed people from my town and the surrounding towns also went to the same school that Colin and I went to. I was hanging out with a Dutch Reformed friend of mine, and we were talking religion, not debating at all. Just kind of talking. And also I'll share at this time, I was already kind of referring to myself, not to my family, but I was kind of referring to myself as a mere Christian at this time. So we were just kind of talking mere Christianity together. And a Muslim friend of mine chimed in, and this Muslim friend was very devoutly Muslim, and he just said, like, how much do you guys know about Islam? And I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I know pretty much nothing about Islam. And his
Yeah.
eyes lit up because he
Hmm.
knew that I was a perfect,
Hmm.
like, he knew that I was willing to talk religion because I've been sitting here talking
Yep.
religion the whole time. But I could
Yep.
see this, like, switch turn on in him, which was his, like, apologetics switch almost.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember looking
I
at
had that
him and being
experience.
like, oh, is this how I am? And I was like, wait a minute, because I saw this light turn on in his eyes. It was the same light as mine, but
Yep.
he was talking about Islam, and when I was doing, I was talking about Catholicism, and that was a really, really weird moment for me, and
Yep.
something that can't happen unless you go to like a really multicultural school, and that is,
That exact same thing happened to me. It wasn't with someone I was close friends with, but that same thing. I happened to be getting food with people, and he was very devoutly Muslim, and I forget how it even came up, but he was like, "Well, do you believe in objective truth?" And I was like, "Oh, you're doing like an apologetics like
yeah,
conversation tree. Like you're gonna ask me this, and then that's gonna lead to this, this, and this." And it was like, oh my god, like that's how I used to approach all of this. Like that's so crazy. It was like a looking in through the looking glass moment for me, for sure.
yeah. And that can't happen unless you go to a school like the school that we went to, where
Yeah.
I think our school, it might not be like number one, but it's like number two or three most diverse campus in the nation.
Yeah.
Um, so where Calion and I grew up in, like, the north part of New Jersey is just a real melting pot. It really is the melting pot of the country. Um, and we went to school in Newark, New Jersey, which is like right. It's kind of part of the greater New York City area. It's a very diverse area, and so we ran into, you'd walk across campus, and you would hear English and Spanish, and
Hear every language.
yeah, I
I
mean, you'd hear languages from the African continent, from
hmm
Asia, from, like, you'd hear everything.
hmm
So it was a really eye-opening experience. But
Yeah, absolutely. I That's pretty much my whole story. Like that's my whole life in a nutshell. Um, but yeah, I'm happy to like talk philosophy. I know it's already like 9:20.
I
But
have no time limits. I wanted
I
to.
don't either, but I don't know. I don't want people to get bored, but I I definitely am happy to go into different philosophical positions, what I actually believe or why. But yeah, I'm pretty much on the same foot with Kevin in a lot of them, so I don't think anything will be surprising to you.
Cool. Um, so I saw my friend, Father John Brown, who is a Jesuit,
Oh
um,
wow.
showed up. So, hey, Father Brown. Father Brown earlier said that he was very late, and so he'll catch up. And so I just want to say, Father, this one was fairly heavy.
Mm.
In editing, I'm going to put like content warnings in here, um, for suicide. So
Yeah.
this one's heavy, um, but I think really worthwhile if I may toot Callion's horn a little bit here. Um, but okay, yeah. There's been a bunch of comments that have come in while we were talking, and I didn't bring all of them up. I brought up a couple of them as they happened.
Hmm.
But I'm going to start taking some questions from the
Sure.
from the crowd. So, and Senor, I'm not positive if this was actually addressed at Calion
Mm.
or if this is kind of just like a to the you know to the hypothetical ex-Catholic in the ether. But why not just be a material atheist like most ex-Catholics?
Mm.
So I guess take it away. Do you want to respond to
Yeah,
this one?
this is probably really referring to because I sort of opened up by being like, philosophically, I would be agnostic and all my positions are pretty much like yours, but from an emotional point of view, I'm more flexible. And I think if I wanted to elaborate on that, it's mostly I know you've talked about this, but the sense of community that you get in especially a traditional like tight knit church community like that is kind of irreplaceable, or you can't really get it anywhere else. And not just that, but so I grew up obsessed with fantasy and reading. Um, My favorite book of all time is Lord of the Rings. I have like way too much Lord of the Rings stuff in my house. And essentially for me, it's sort of like this idea that Tolkien talks about in a lot of his essays, of natural enchantment being a quality of life that is sort of comes easier, I think, to people who are religious because you start out believing in the supernatural, and so you're sort of more willing to be enchanted by things that have natural explanations. Um, but I don't really want to lose that in my life of finding the world enchanting and magical in its own way. Not that it doesn't make sense or that it doesn't follow natural laws or anything like that. I know it does, but there's something meaningful to me about engaging with the world on a sort of on a metaphysical way, a plane, even if there is no such thing, if that makes sense. Like it's mentally and psychologically edifying for me.
Do you mind if I try to put a little bit of like philosophical language to what
Yeah,
you just
go
said?
go for it, go for it.
So, um, I'm a nominalist. Nominalists will often speak as if nominalism were false. So I might say that the lid to this jar right here is red. Oh, well, Kevin, you're a nominalist. So strictly speaking, this isn't red because redness doesn't exist.
Right.
I'm not going to say, like, oh, the photons that bounce off of this are at a certain wavelength, which I perceive as red. No, I'm just going to say it's red. Why? Because I'm speaking fictionally. Fictionalism is a type of nominalism. So you could be like a fictionalist nominalist, in which you're pretty much saying, like, yeah, this metaphysical stuff, it doesn't really exist, but I'm going to talk as if it does anyway.
I think from a sort of biomedical point of view, there's something about people that is hardwired to sort of feel that connection. Like
Bingo.
when people take DMT or do mushrooms,
That's the next question.
it's not that they're experiencing like real spiritual experiences, although what is a real spiritual experience? But like it's not that it's not meaningful or important or beautiful in its own way. And I don't want to lose that appreciation for that sort of aspect of life. And I think that's why I don't always call myself an atheist, because that has a lot of connotations and implications that people think that you're just going to be like, well, science is science and that makes the world boring and why should I care about it? And it's like, well, science is great and I appreciate it and I'm glad that it exists and I think everything can be explained pretty much naturally, but I like having this sense of wonder at the world. Not that the two are exclusive, but it for me, I like having that other layer to it.
Yeah. And so I used to love reading as like a kid, and then in college I kind of stopped reading so much. But
Same.
then, as I became less religious, I started reading a lot more fiction,
Mm.
and now I love reading. Like I read like every single night. And I think it's partially because I'm trying to kind of fill this, you know, religious hole in my chest, kind of. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that fiction, particularly like fantasy, kind of scratches a lot of those same itches
Oh yeah.
um, in in that natural enchantment. And Daniel's gonna steal that. He says he's gonna add natural enchantment. Or it already is, I think, a large part of his own Catholic spirituality.
I mean, Tolkien was Catholic. I have a lot of respect
Yeah,
for Catholics who can engage. And then, like I said, folk Catholicism is a fascinating, beautiful thing that a lot of different people engage with, and it's very much a part of that. Um, I will say, like, to your point about fiction sort of filling that hole, like I remember in fourth grade when I first read The Silmarillion, which is like Tolkien's big lore book. There's a creation myth in it, and I remember reading it and being like, this is what a religious experience feels like, because I never really felt the religious experiences that people say you're supposed to feel with God and through prayer. And then I would read that and I'm like, oh, is this what religion feels like? And I remember telling people like, oh, it's better than the Bible, it's written better. Like, even when I was Catholic, I'm like, hey, it is what it is. And I think now that I'm not Catholic, I can be like, well, you know what, like if the Bible's not literally true, which, you know, that's a whole other discussion, but I do not believe that it is. Um, And some people will say, well, it still has good moral lessons and things like that. And if it's not a true book, I'd rather take a book that's not true that is more meaningful to me or has better moral lessons. And for me, that's, a lot of fantasy books or things that will lift you out of the moment and put you in a different situation and give you a different perspective on life.
Yeah, 100%. I want to go to a question from CJ.
Yeah.
And you touched on it a little bit. So CJ's question was, have you ever done any? And don't feel
I
pressured to answer anything that you don't want to answer. Just to let you know.
I have not. I would love to.
Me too.
It's one of those things I'm like, oh, I'll do that, and then I just never schedule it. But it's like one of those things, like it's absolutely something I want to try just because it sounds like a really cool experience, and I think there's a lot of good and insight to be gained from it. But I mean, for me, I would always consider it a natural experience. It's not something metaphysical, but it doesn't make it less meaningful or less beautiful or important.
Yeah, I have a very strong desire to go do ayahuasca. Like,
Oof, that's a rough one.
I know, but I've been told that the way that you feel afterwards is like insane. Like not when you're actively tripping.
No, yeah,
But
yeah.
like the next day, apparently you just want to like hug the entire earth.
Mm-hmm.
And like I've heard people say that like people who come off of the high of ayahuasca sound very similar to the kinds of people who go up into outer space, they see the whole earth, and then they come back down, where like you just get this overwhelming feeling of like kind of connectedness and love for the whole earth and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just awesome.
Yeah, even if it's just a natural feeling, it sounds like a pretty good one. I'd like to experience it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who would argue that all feelings are natural feelings.
Exactly.
So like
Exactly.
I don't make a huge delineation between something like ayahuasca and something like and you'll forgive my crassness, but like, the high that you might feel after receiving the Eucharist or something like that. And again, crass question, but or crass analogy, but
No, but I agree. I think my only point with that earlier discussion about not necessarily labeling myself as atheist is just it's because I like to sort of maintain the illusion of that distinction for myself. Not because I think there actually is one, but because I think elevating certain experiences from my own perspective is helpful for me assigning value.
yeah. Father Brown chimes in with the unpopular opinion, but makes the analogy of psychedelic drugs to authentic spirituality and porn to authentic love. I guess my question for Father would be something like this. How many like devoutly religious people do you know who have also done psychedelic drugs? I don't know any, to be honest.
It's funny that he says this because this is actually an opinion I've seen expressed by a lot of occultists that get very annoyed when people are like, oh, you should do drugs and it'll help you enhance your mental state or whatever. They'll be like, no, it's very serious business. You need to do the rituals very soberly and it all yada yada yada, because it's you have to make sure it's a real spiritual experience. Which, I mean, if spiritual experiences are real, then that is necessarily makes sense. To me, I would say probably that a real spiritual experience is a subjective understanding of what that means, and that there are lots of ways to induce those experiences that aren't drugs. Yeah.
CJ is talking about like a little bit of concerned about like opening doors to other places with psychedelics. If you're referring to like, the way that like Joe Rogan and the Joe Roganites will talk about like the little green men that they see when they do like mushrooms and stuff like that, I wouldn't get too hung up on that, CJ. I think it's just funny trips, man. That's really all I think.
If you're talking about demons, though, like I've got other things that are probably bigger doors that they could walk through. So
yeah, that's a fair point. And Father Brown says that he knows a few who've used psychedelics. They are the one who helped you come to your conclusion.
Fair enough.
Cool. Yeah. I don't personally know any like devoutly religious person who has also done psychedelics. Like out of the people that I know, those two groups, people who've done psychedelics and people who are devoutly religious, are mutually exclusive. But again, that's just my experience, and I'm certainly not representative of, I don't know every single religious person in the whole world, and I don't know every single person who's ever done psychedelic drugs in the whole world.
Yeah,
If you don't mind, I'm gonna propose a question to you,
sure.
and you do not have to answer it. It was asked a little bit ago. The conversation's really good in the chat, but there was a question from Senor. So personal question, and even Senor Cinema says you don't have to answer. But as someone who also struggles with suicidal ideation, how do you overcome these thoughts?
I mean, for me, it was because the ideation was for a reason. It was because I was looking at the future of my life under the framework of, you know, the religion that I had been brought up to believe. And it was just not a hopeful or edifying future that I could see for myself. I know that sounds harsh, I guess, to Catholicism, but it's just the way it was. And maybe I had an incorrect understanding of it, or whatever. But to me, it seemed like I was being asked to essentially live a life that wasn't full, and other people were being encouraged, allowed, and celebrated for doing that. And it was sort of an empty feeling. There was a lot of stress. There's just a lot of stress, and it was exhausting. And honestly, what helped me overcome it is by not being stressed about it, because realizing it wasn't real and it wasn't something that was actually going to matter for eternal salvation for my soul. Not being afraid of going to hell was a big part of it, and not being afraid of living my life and being who I am and accepting myself and trying my best to be happy and to lead a good life, on my own terms. That was really what helped. Not that I don't struggle with, depression and things like that. And I think a lot of people do, but it's not like a cure-all. But for me, that's what it was.
Um, I'll add something just with the first caveat that I haven't struggled with suicidal ideation per se, just your normal stuff that I'm sure every extrad has, which is some level of anxiety and stuff like that. But um, I've found that this is gonna sound kind of stupid, but doing this helps me a lot. Um, I view a lot of my YouTube channel as just journaling out loud. Um, I've referred to it in past videos as also like struggling out loud. Um, but the common denominator between those two is the doing it out loud part. And I think even if you don't want to share it with the whole internet, you don't have to share it with the whole internet. But journaling, just plain old writing it down, is still kind of doing it out loud. And I don't mean like literally you don't have to speak your journal, but just getting it outside of you. Like don't, instead of keeping it all inside, like,
Yeah.
um, that has helped me a lot. I'd say that like a year ago, my anxiety was considerably worse than it is now. Um, and I think just kind of talking out loud about it helps me. And again, just the qualifier that maybe this only helps you to a certain extent, and maybe if you're struggling with something worse than what I'm struggling with, then only take my
I
advice for what it's worth. Pretty much is what I'm saying.
I would also say, like, for me, I obviously I was talking about it earlier, but I had very bad experiences with therapy. But I currently go to therapy. I have been. It's very helpful. Obviously, you have to find someone who is helpful for you and is giving you what you need. But being able to tell someone your feelings, that can sort of be like, do you see why this is not making sense, or do you see why this is an irrational thing, or do you see why this doesn't really follow? It could be nice to have that sort of outside, like, huh, you're right, that doesn't make sense, because you can kind of get stuck in an internal loop of thoughts. um, and also concrete strategies that people like that can provide for you for ways to combat that kind of ideation are very helpful. And there's nothing wrong with asking people for help or talking about things like that to people. I definitely encourage it.
Yeah. Um, a, I think a couple quick ones. This isn't a question from Daniel, but I just like this notion. So Daniel says that when he prays for people outside the church, he first prays for the many shortcomings and black marks on the church. We are not perfect, and I think that's really cool. So I just want to say one of the many reasons I like Daniel. Um, also, there was so I don't want to stay on this whole drug topic for like ever, especially because like Calion and I are not
No.
like we grew up trad Catholic. We're really not people who have any
Yeah.
experience with this stuff. Um, but
I
so
mean, weed is legal in New Jersey. I do smoke recreationally,
there
but
you
that's
go.
about it.
Um,
Oh, look at
but
that. Okay.
yeah, so there we go. Now I know one. And then Aiden also added, I won't do them again, but they led me to the transcendent. So, okay.
It's actually not that uncommon for people to have sort of experiences that lead them to explore religion again when they weren't necessarily before.
Yeah. And saying that you wouldn't do them again. Rosemary said that if she ever does psychedelics, it wouldn't be for the religious experience; it'd be doing it for the medical, psychological
Mm.
benefits. So with proper supervision, that's the way that I foresee me doing them one day too. It would be under supervision, and it wouldn't be with the intent of making it a regular thing. It would be.
Well, there's actually it's interesting because they've done research on, or they're starting to do research on it, and psilocybin they've been finding not
Yeah.
like tripping levels of dosages, but sort of microdosing it can help with depression a lot. So I'm not sure if that's what Rosemary's talking about, but I mean that's definitely a valid path to go down if you have sort of medical supervision and they suggest it for you.
The psilocybin trials that I've looked at. So I I may have mentioned this on other streams, but I work in pharma, so like this is kind
Hmm.
of stuff that I'm fairly familiar with. I've looked at some of those clinical trials for psilocybin, and it's all very early,
Yeah, it's
but
very
the
preliminary.
but the data is astounding.
Yeah, it's
So
nice.
if it shapes up to be like if phase 2, 3, and 4 trials
Hmm.
go as well as the preliminary data suggests, like psilocybin could be a wonder drug
Yeah.
for depression and anxiety. Like that'd be insane if that'd be so cool.
I mean, there's a certain intuitive level on which it makes sense. You know, if this sort of if it's inducing a sort of connected experiential feeling, which is clearly something that humans crave. Um, it's a big driving force behind religions and other ritual activity. Um, in a secular society, a modern secular society, there's a lot less opportunities for that sort of itch to be scratched, and so it makes sense that that sort of might be something we're missing lately.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there was a little bit of an interesting back and forth. So Senor Cinema said that there's a book by Oscar, and then I'm probably going to mispronounce the last name, but something like Yaniger maybe,
Hmm.
um, where he gave LSD to religious leaders in the
Yes,
50s,
I heard
and
about this.
and then Father chimes in saying that he thinks
Oh,
that this was a fake study. This is the first I've heard about it, to be honest. So I don't know.
well, if it's fake, then it's fake. But it'd be interesting to see some data.
Yeah, we'll do research. Maybe I'll start a script on it after I look
Sure.
into it. Um, and I don't know how much longer you want to go, but CJ says, Callian, thank you for sharing your story, and Kevin for sharing your journal with us. And hey, thanks for listening. I never thought that I would actually have like any audience at all. And you know, the 11 of you guys currently watching have been very vocal, which is super cool. Um, and so I'm super grateful for you guys, and I'm super grateful that Callian um, reached out and wanted to do the episode. I think that this episode was quite possibly the most important episode I think I've ever done. Um, and by important, I mean one of the goals that I kind of set out with when I started this channel. One of them was selfish. I won't lie. One of the selfish goal was I want to journal out loud and kind of just get it all out there so that I could feel better. But another one of my goals was that I wanted to, if I could help other people too, I wanted to, you know? Otherwise, I could just write it down in a journal and not tell anybody ever. I could upload all these videos and keep them private, but I don't. And I don't do that because I wanted to make episodes like this one, where we talk about stuff that's really, really freaking heavy. Um,
I mean, I think from my experience, a lot of Catholics get very caught up in the philosophy and sort of the theology of things, and it's all very logical, and intellectual, and I think it's good to remind people that there's real people that are on the other end of this, and that there are consequences to some of these beliefs.
And you can tell how I grew up too, because I get very, like, even in my ex-Catholicism, I'm very philosophical, and
I mean, same.
yeah, sometimes I'm going to quote my friend Adam, who did an episode very similar to this one from a little bit ago, where Adam said something to the effect of, you should let your knowledge of how your beliefs are going to impact other people impact the readiness that you accept or reject that belief.
Yes.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. If you want to, dive headfirst into some kind of religion that has absolutely no impact on anybody's rights or freedoms, sure, pursue that with reckless abandon. But I think if you're going to pursue a religion, and then especially when you start getting into like Catholic integralism and stuff like that, where like they want to make it straight up illegal, not just gay marriage, but they want to make eating meat on Fridays illegal and stuff like that. I think that you should think twice, think about how that impacts other people and let that kind of guide your epistemology.
100%, especially coming from the traditional world like we do, and where the traditional world is now. It's a lesson they could take.
Yeah, and I do worry about the future too of the traditionalism movement.
Well,
it only seems to be getting more and more radical.
That's a whole other conversation.
We'll be here for another hour and a half if we do that. I'll pull up another thank you. And Nick also says that he hopes to see Calion around. I've got a Discord. If you're on Discord, you're more than welcome to join.
I am on Discord. I have not seen you post the Discord anywhere.
I don't post it a whole lot.
Post it.
I should.
Put it on your channel.
See, here's the thing. I'm not very good at responding in my Discord, so I'm a little worried about all these people wanting my attention, and I don't give them attention.
I think half the point of a Discord is just for people to connect over the subject matter you like to talk about. So you don't have to respond to everything.
Tell you what. I'm sending you the link, obviously, but
sure.
I'll put it in the description of this video too. And maybe I don't want to commit to this, but maybe I'll be good about putting it in, future videos where I'll end it by saying, hey, join the conversation in my Discord, link down below. We'll see about that. No promises, but I think that I more or less, and I just want to say, thanks, Daniel. He sees this channel as a ministry. I think that's high praise. So thank you. But I think that I've essentially said my closing remarks. Calion, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm good. Just, I do want to tell you that when I saw that you had this channel, it was actually very exciting because there isn't a lot of ex-Catholic content. There's a lot of deconstruction content about evangelicalism and a lot of Protestant stuff, and even more and more with Islam and stuff, but not as much for Catholics. And I think that it's an important thing, just because a lot of the experiences are so unique, especially from traditional Catholicism. So I love what you're doing. Keep it up.
Thank you.
And thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I want to say that I had a blast. I'm not quite sure that really summarizes the conference. I did have fun. And more importantly, I feel like we did something important today.
I hope so.
I think we did. So thanks everybody for tuning in. This is Kevin and Calion, and until next time.